welcome back everybody. This is the JF-17 Thunder, and I've been doing some research on it, some additional research, and playing around with it a little bit. And I still don't know enough to really go into detail about how to use it at all, which I'm not likely to do. But I did want to talk about in a little bit more detail kind of some of the things that I like about it, some of the things that have drawn my attention to it previously, and then some things that I'm learning about it now that I do like. Originally, I thought that this was kind of an ugly aircraft, and I thought it was really old. And but it's an interesting aircraft because it does. Anybody that's done research on this aircraft knows that it kind of came about from, or it has some early ancestry in the MiG-21, and it kind of actually looks like it has some ancestry in the MiG-21, but then it's gone through several project iterations that have changed it into quite a different aircraft, obviously. But yeah, I used to think it was ugly, and I still, from certain angles, I still kind of think it's ugly. But it's sort of a pretty ugly aircraft, and from certain angles and views, it looks really, really good. And of course, looks don't really matter. It's more an issue of function. Does it function correctly? And I think that there are some areas where it's probably going to prove to function really, really well, and it's going to be very capable. So my understanding is that this particular version is the Block 1, and it's compared to the F-16 quite a bit, which I think is fair. I think that's probably the best comparison to make. In terms of capability, I don't believe that it's nearly as capable as a more modern later block F-16, but it is cheaper. They say that it's about half the cost of an F-16. Money, and I've said this in other videos, price is always really weird when it comes to fighter jets because you can calculate the price a number of different ways. When I go look up publicly available numbers on the F-16, I usually find a 1998 number, which if you inflation adjust that to 2017 dollars, it's almost identical to the 2017 calculations for the JF-17 Thunder. But that's not to say that if you bought an F-16 in 2017, it would be $30 million. So I think it's probably safe to say that that the whole Thunder being half the cost of an F-16 is probably a pretty fair number. I think that that's probably pretty straightforward. The problem is that there are some features that this Block 1 doesn't have that the F-16 has. So I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe that Block 2 and Block 3 Thunder aircraft will be a little bit more expensive as they gain some capability. But having said that, they do have quite a bit of capability. There's a lot that's really good about this. For one thing, and this is something that I've learned since I've been toying with the module, I like the cockpit layout. It seems pretty straightforward, and I really like the way these displays are set up, and the way you can change the top and the bottom. You can kind of set them up to be the way you want. And there's a lot of data that can be displayed here, and it's not very cluttered. It almost looks like what you might see in a lower fidelity game, like an Arma game or something. If somebody made a jet mod for Arma and they didn't know what the cockpit looked like, it might look like this. I think that there was a cockpit kind of like this in one of the Battlefield games. There was like a modern fighter, and if I remember right, it just had displays everywhere, which that's not that far-fetched, obviously. But really what I like here is the versatility and how the pilot can kind of set it up to see what they want, where they want, and that these you can kind of adjust the bottom part of the screen and the top part of the screen independent of each other. There's a lot of sensors, and this sort of, if you look at this, you've got 4 sensors around this upfront controller, I'll call it, and it's sort of symmetrical. It's sort of aesthetically pleasing. I like kind of this display is telling us a lot of things that are going on. You've got a display down here telling us warnings and things like that. Everything's relatively straightforward and simple. And even our radio down here is digital. Everything's kind of digital. It's not, we don't have a ton of analog stuff going on. So I guess the old school argument for analog would be that it's not as prone to failure. I don't know if that's necessarily true anymore, but anyway, the cockpit is very nice. There's some things that I'm sure would take me some time to get used to that I wouldn't be quite ready for, switching over from kind of the Western aircraft into this. But for the most part, this upfront controller looks fairly straightforward. It's not a lot of times what happens in the aircraft that I'm used to is you wind up with like little buttons and dials everywhere, because as functionality gets included, they've got to put a button or a switch somewhere. So they just it seems like they just sort of pop up here and there as somebody thinks of something new to put on the aircraft. So this is nice. And again, I don't know that much about it, but it's nice. I think it would be fun to get to know this aircraft a little better. Let's talk for a minute about the things on the outside of the aircraft that I like. First of all, I like the idea of low-cost, lightweight fighters. And I've talked about this in a previous video as well. I would actually like to see a fighter jet kind of like this, or like the F-16, like the F-5 Tiger, maybe a Rafale or a Gripen kind of an aircraft, but one that doesn't even have a radar, that uses data link with AWACS or with bigger fighters, more expensive fighters, uses that data link to identify targets. You could even potentially have something like an AWACS doing the controlling of the missiles, and this is just a launch platform that data links up to the AWACS. I don't know how feasible that is, but I think it would be feasible. So I'd like to see that. That's not what this aircraft is. It does have a fairly capable radar, but I would certainly like to see that. I like this size of a fighter compared to the F-16. It's almost identical. The F-16 is slightly bigger, and I mean slightly, very slightly. But the first two, and these are really the only two features on this aircraft that really initially drew me to it, and that is they're both right here. We've got this really large, pronounced leading edge root extension. And those definitely seem to help when they're made correctly. They definitely seem to help with high angle of attack performance. The other thing is this bump right there, and that's documented in a lot of the places where you'll read about this aircraft. That is a diverterless supersonic inlet, and what you'll notice is right here I can see that compressor blade or compressor spinning in there, but I can't anywhere else. Now, what's usually documented about these diverterless supersonic inlets, and it's true, is that they help reduce the speed of the air coming into the inlet. Normally, what happens is you have to separate the boundary layer coming around the body of the aircraft before it goes into the inlet, so that as you get into the transonic and supersonic stages of flight, you don't cause problems with the engine. But you can see all these little kind of tiny holes on the bump, and then out here on this this intake, those are all part of that system. So it helps separate the boundary air, and slow down the air coming into that inlet, so that you can not have problems. Another feature there is, and you can't really see it very well here. Well, you kind of can. That inlet is forward swept, and that's part of it too. I don't know exactly how that incorporates into the design, but that's part of the design feature there. So those are the two design features. When I first saw this jet, I kind of thought, hey, that's interesting. That might actually be a really good thing. Let's compare real quickly to some other aircraft. It's going to take a minute for this to switch, I think. Okay, here we go. This is not the one I intended, but you can see here, this is a Eurofighter Typhoon, and obviously they are separating the boundary air. This is the more traditional way, and you can see stealth is another part of this. You can see those spinning blades in there, the compressors. That's a big time stealth consideration. The JF-17 does way better than this Eurofighter, because a radar sees that and makes identification calculations, I guess is for lack of a better term, about this aircraft. And anywhere that it can see those spinning blades, it's gonna get some really big clues as to what this aircraft is and where it is and what it's doing. So you can see two things that are different here. We've got a big splitter there to separate off boundary air before it goes in the inlet, which I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine that that creates more drag than a diverterless supersonic inlet. And we also have some stealth considerations. Okay, so here's the Rafael. It's also splitting off some boundary air. This is a much lower, well, these are both kind of lower fidelity models, I think, but so you can't see much there, but kind of the same concept. Here is the F-14, and this one's very interesting. This is kind of an old school way of doing things. There is some boundary air separation there along the body, but this also has ramps, and you can kind of see them in there. The ramps change position at different speeds. Um, these doors kind of come down, and I think if I remember right, other things open up. It'll let air out up here. So the ramps come down to kind of deflect some of the air as it comes in, and it changes the speed of that air and the compressibility of the air, or the compression of the air maybe. I'm not a scientist on this kind of stuff, so I don't deal with this kind of stuff on a normal basis. It's passing sort of hobby knowledge. The F-15 is very, very similar, and you've probably seen, if you've flown the F-15, you've seen these ramps, the front of the nozzle, or the front of the intake, ramps down at different stages of flight. And again, you can see those compressor blades in there. So same thing, we've got along the body, we've got these gaps separating out the boundary air, and then the ramps inside to kind of change how that airflow comes in. F-16, once again, separating boundary air. We don't really have ramps. This one was kind of a more, I guess, passive design, and it's been a while since I've read up on it, but it's something about the shape of that intake. But again, we can see the blades in there. We can see the compressor, and a radar can see that as well. Yep, F-18, very distinctive way to separate off the boundary layer, and we've got ways for the air to kind of come up over the top of the fuselage after it's separated, and of course it can come down the bottom as well on those channels that you can see there. There's also some shaped ducting there, which kind of hides the compressors a little bit, I think. So that can possibly help a little bit, but it's really the same concept. And then finally, or not finally, we've got one more after this. The F-22 is a little bit different. Obviously, stealth was a huge consideration, but what you see there is still boundary separation using some traditional methodology. So it's kind of interesting that it still has a gap between the intake and the fuselage. And then the F-22, which this one's really, really cool, I guess, because we've got this big bump, and I don't know how accurate this model is. It looks like it's a pretty decent model, but anyway, we've seen these in real life. There's this big bump that kind of pushes the air out a little bit. We've got a forward swept intake, just like on the JF-17, and in this case, I don't know that you can see the turbines. Now, this model could also just not have them, but I've looked at pictures before, and it's really hard to see the turbines in there. So that's one of the things they did on this to increase stealth, and that's something that I think is actually a really good idea. It's what I call low-tech stealth, and I think it's important because that kind of stealth does not require a lot of additional maintenance time per flight hour. Where if in the case of the F-22 and the F-35, there's materials on them that are very expensive, and they're very hard to dispose of, and they're very hard to deal with, and you've got to reapply them over time, special paint, special coatings, whatever they are, I don't really know. But it's pretty clear, and data is proving out that the sortie rates on those aircraft are much lower than what would be on something like this, or something like an F-16 or an F-5 or even F-15s, even bigger, more complicated aircraft, which do require more maintenance and are much more expensive. Even on those, they typically have higher sortie rates than something that has the higher tech stealth, like radar absorbent materials and things like that. Another thing that you could do is smart planform design. And let me cycle back through these real quick. It might take me a minute, as long as I don't go too far. So smart planform design is kind of like this, and this isn't ideal, but if you can look at this, look at the light gray areas. So if we're right above the aircraft, look at the leading edge of the intakes, and look at the leading edge of the wings, and look at the leading edge of the what you would call the vertical stabilizers and the horizontal stabilizers. They're all the same angle. And then parts of the trailing edges are as well. Then if you look at it from the side, this one's a little bit harder. Let me get over here on this side. Again, if you look at the intake, the side part of the intake, it's got a very similar angle to the back edge of the vertical stabilizer. So from what I've heard, that kind of a thing helps scatter radar energy in the way that you would want. So that's what I've heard. I don't know. That stuff is way above my head, but that's what I've heard. So things like that I think could be beneficial. The F-35 doesn't do it nearly as much. It does have a little bit of that kind of design, but not nearly as much. And I don't know if they found something better or something that worked differently, or if they just had to make other design considerations instead. I'm not really for sure, but it's not quite that way. But ultimately, I'd like to see low-tech stealth like that. Make it small, make it light, and make it an efficient engine. Maybe don't give it a radar, but give it IRST, which if I understand correctly, the Block 3 JF-17 should have IRST. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it will. Do some things like that, so that instead of a big heavy radar in the front, so you can make it small, agile, stay in the air a little bit longer, higher sortie rates, and then just make it as low observability as possible using low-tech stealth considerations instead of high-tech that are going to keep it on the ground longer. As far as performance goes, this isn't quite as capable as the F-16. It is lighter, a touch smaller, a decent amount lighter. I think empty weight is like 2,000 pounds lighter, but the F-16 can carry quite a bit more in terms of fuel and payload. The F-16 has more thrust capability, has a larger wing area, and these aren't all the considerations. These aren't all that matters. But if you're trying to save some money, giving up some of that capability is probably fine, because in a lot of cases you won't necessarily need like top speed. You don't necessarily need top speed. You do need to be fast. You need to be agile. You need to accelerate quickly and things like that. But you don't necessarily need to always be tooling around at Mach 1.6 or 1.8 or whatever. So I think that this has a higher range. Range numbers are kind of like price numbers. It's kind of hard to say because what loadout are you in? Like what's the loadout on the aircraft, and if you've got fuel tanks or not, if you're carrying a bunch of stuff that's draggy, or whatever, then you're not going to have as much range. But I do think that this has a higher range than an F-16, and which is good, and it does have really comparable capabilities. It's just a little bit less capable, I think, in a lot of situations, or on paper anyway. One other thing, and then I'll shut up because we're coming up on 20 minutes, and this is longer than I intended. But I think it's good stuff to talk about and think about. But one of the other things that I like about this aircraft is the gun. Now I'm a big fan of the rotary, the Gatlin type rotary gun, but this gun is a twin barrel. It's actually two guns in one, so to speak. And it's, if I remember right, it's basically the same gun that was in the MiG-21. It's in a lot of aircraft, and even it's even in the Tu-95 as a tail gun. And I think in that configuration it can shoot chaff and flares out of the gun, which is really cool. But I thought I invented this gun. Whenever I was a teenager, I came up with this idea once I kind of learned about blowback in guns, blowback operation. Um, I came up with this idea where I would take two guns and I would use the recoil of one to push that chamber open and push the second chamber closed, loading it, and then when it fired, it would do the opposite. Well, that's what this gun does, and I just think it's cool. It's not as fast as a rotary cannon, but it also doesn't have to spin up, and it's obviously going to be heavier than a single barrel gun, but it reduces for the same rate of fire, or which I don't know that you can even get to that rate of fire in a single barreled gun, but it produces a lot less heat and a lot less mechanical wear. So that's cool. I just thought it was cool, and it's kind of an old gun, but I think why change it if it works really well, and it seems to work pretty well. Um, I think that's about it. Those are my thoughts on the JF-17 Thunder at this point. I would like to test it out a little bit more, get a little bit more kind of some capability tests, and learn the sensors and the cockpit a little bit better. And I think that would be pretty cool. But for now, those are my sort of my initial thoughts on the subject of the JF-17 Thunder. So I definitely appreciate everybody watching, and happy flying.